I'm going to give a talk today about some of the ways in which many, many years spent in the trenches of literary translation have helped me as a creative writer, and particularly ways in which I've used translation techniques to create my own poems. And to do that, I kind of have to get a little bit into the theory of translation, which I'll do for a little while. And so it'll start out theoretical and end up rather practical. So let me get started. Actually, before I get started, I want to just thank Anna Leahy and the Chapman University and all of you guys for coming out and making this possible, and for bringing me here, and for making this event happen in this beautiful building. So this talk is called The Three Paradoxes of Literary Translation. And there is a deep paradox at the heart of literary translation. The translator works from an original to create a work of literature in a new language. But since it's a copy, by its very nature, it can't be an original, and thus it can't be literature. So we may as well just hang up our hats and go home. There can't really be world literature if there can't be translation. And if we don't have world literature, we're stuck within our own language. Luckily, however, what I've just told you is an utter lie. It's a lie because there's a second and deeper paradox at the heart of the translator's craft. Translators create new originals in the new language, which by their very nature cannot be copies. We are musicians interpreting a score. We're not interlingual fax machines. However, because we believe the opposite, because we believe the first paradox, that we are creating copies, not originals, therefore we don't judge our translations in the same way that writers judge original literary works. Vladimir Nabokov, the great novelist, declares, quote, "The clumsiest literal translation is 1,000 times more useful than the prettiest paraphrase." I'll say that again. The clumsiest literal translation is 1,000 times more useful than the prettiest paraphrase. Following Nabokov's idea and hoping to make good copies, we make clumsy literature. That's why translations read like, well, translations. I have here in my wallet a copy of a $20 bill that I printed out on my university copier. Outside of the fact that I had to tear it and it's all kind of ragged around the edges, it looks just like a $20 bill. After all, it's a copy, right? So I've got a question. Would anyone in the room care to trade their own $20 bill that's in your wallet for mine? No? Really? Nobody wants to have the distinguished poets run off a copy of a $20 bill? I'm surprised. Well, let me ask you this. Why not? Why not? Why would you want to keep your $20 bill? I mean, I have one right here. It's a copy, right? A little bit louder?
So you can't buy anything with it.
You can't buy anything with it. It has no value, you might say. Okay. Well, it has a serial number on it. It has a picture of a president on it. It has all these weird symbols on it. It has a signature by the Secretary of the Treasury. It says the United States of America on it. Apparently God himself or herself or itself thinks that it's money, and God we trust. It has a lot of things that say it has value, right? So, but you still don't want to trade with me, right? Well, okay. I guess the key thing is that although your $20 bill has all those things, and my $20 bill has all these things, mine is not somehow authorized, right? So it remains a forgery. So it has no value. Well, let's take a different tack here. All right, it is true that this has no value as money, but this is, after all, a literary event. And let me pass this around. I have about only 20 copies, but to give you an idea of what the actual reproduction is, because I did a little surgery on it to make it more interesting for a literary crowd. I figured, well, for a literary crowd, we don't really need the Secretary of the Treasury to sign it. How about we have, the god of literary criticism, Jacques Derrida. So I found a copy of Jacques Derrida's signature, and I popped that in there. And I figure, okay, that's the critical side. How about the literary side? I got Walt Whitman's signature and popped that in there as well. And then I figured we don't need any presidents on there. Let's put Walt Whitman on there. He's the father of American poetry. And then, you know, instead of some abstruse, strange Masonic symbol, how about we put in the symbol for the Emerson Literary Society? And then, as long as we're being wacky and spiritual, I put in the Chinese character for the Tao, the way, the path, Dharma, the good life. So I figure then it becomes a much more interesting object. But I guess then the question, at this point, of course I gave you all copies, but would it at this point be worth anything more to you? Not worth $20, huh? Okay. I guess this raises certain issues for me. Is the poem in translation like this a photocopy of an original that, despite whatever changes you make to it, has no value, no aesthetic value, because it's not authorized, it's not done by an author. The author is the one who creates. With the author resides the genius. The translator is merely a kind of a copy machine, according to this notion, right? The translation itself, therefore, like the $20 bill copy, also has no value, because the act has no value, and the translation is merely a window through which somehow or other it's a transparent window through which we're supposed to see the genius of the original. It's not an opaque thing that has its own unity. It's simply a medium through which we're supposed to get to the original. So then the question becomes, if you believe that translation should be art, how do you authorize a translation? How do you give it value when, by its very nature, everything we know about the economy of literature tells us it has no value at all? I'm going to give you an example, again having to do with money. There's an artist named J.S.G. Boggs. J.S.G. Boggs does an interesting thing. Here's his shtick. He takes $100 bills, and then with color pencils, very, very carefully and very, very precisely, he draws them. So they look realistically exactly the same as the original, but he draws them, okay? Then he runs limited editions off on a color laser printer that on beautiful paper of that. And then he goes into expensive hotels and expensive restaurants, and he stays the night, or he has a beautiful dinner. And then when they ask him to pay, he says, well, I do have money. I have a credit card, but I also have this $100 bill that I drew. And that has, I'm a famous artist, I'm in all these museums, and these collectors have collected me. So chances are this $100 bill that I drew will actually be worth more than $100. Interestingly enough, about 40% of the places he goes actually accept it. So what J.S.G. Boggs has done with art is what I'm hoping to talk to you guys about how to do with poetry and potentially with fiction. But before we get into that, and maybe as a way of getting into that, we really need to talk about the third and deepest paradox at the heart of literary translation, which is that, in fact, speaking of Jacques Derrida, in fact, there is no original text to translate. To begin with, there's no original to reproduce. Jean Baudrillard, the literary theorist, writes, a copy such as Disneyland, just up the street here, a copy such as Disneyland, quote, is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, whereas all of Los Angeles and the America that surrounds it are no longer real, but belong to the order of simulation. It's no longer a question of the false representation of reality, but of concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus of saving the reality principle. In the economy of literature, a belief in the text itself constitutes the reality principle. Thus, we call a translation a copy to conceal the fact that the original itself becomes a simulation the moment that we read it. After all, the reading act is a subjective intercourse with a shifting lover. It gives birth to brain children of wildly different shapes and different readers and in different minds. Octavio Paz, the great poet, declares, language itself, in its essence, is already a translation, because all literary meaning-making is a translation of a graphic sign to a mental act. Reading is translation. Because the original text is not even equal to itself, like translation, reading is always a transformation of an unstable source. At the core of the three paradoxes of translation is the perennial question among translators. Should one translate the letter of the original or the spirit of the original? And perhaps the best way to answer this question would be to read you the parable of the translator from my book, The Golem of Los Angeles, which I'm going to read from my text here instead from the book. And let's see whether it opens things up. The parable of the translator. In the spirit of scientific inquiry, a surgeon tried to step outside of his own skin so he could see what skin was. First, he carefully applied a scalpel to himself. Then he shucked the skin off like a wetsuit. There it was, draped on the chair like a deflated blow-up doll. And there was the surgeon, all raw nerves, staring at his punctured self and screaming. Quickly, he stepped back into his skin and stitched himself up again, but now his fingers were on his feet. His toes were on his hands, his mouth spoke from between his buttock cheeks, and his long white beard hung down from his crotch. His wife ran in and yelled, "My God, what have you done with yourself?" But the scientist just pursed his buttocks into a smile and said calmly, "I've made myself into something entirely new." "But your skin," she wept. "What have you done with your skin?" "Oh, sweetheart," he said kindly, caressing her cheek with his horny toes. "Why do you have to be so literal?" It's supposed to be a joke. Feel free to laugh. Or not. Okay. Oh, dear. Why do you have to be so literal? And what does it mean to be literal when the three paradoxes of literary translation tell us that there is no such thing as a literal meaning, only multiple interpretations of the reading experience? What are you being literal to exactly? On the other hand, to be literary versus literal might mean to be able to embrace the mistake, to love the failure, to get to the right destination by taking the wrong road. This is one of the insights that creativity theorist Edward de Bono speaks of in his book, Lateral Thinking. He notes that in quote-unquote vertical thinking, which is linear, progressive, and logical, one moves forward by sequential steps, each of which must be justified, as to say, as in a scientific proof. However, in lateral thinking, which is to say in creative thinking, one might have to be wrong at some stage in order to achieve the correct solution. So in this talk, therefore, I'm going to be discussing with you some interesting way that I and other writers have come up with to do so through embracing the freedom at the heart of the three paradoxes, by being wrong and by creating bad translations in the hopes of making something that might be good literature. Kenneth Rexroth, the poet and translator, puts it like this: translation is the best way to keep your tools sharp. Most relationships, no matter how loving, suffer eventually from what's called bed death. Once the chemicals in the brain change and habituation sets in. In other words, married couples stop having sex. Language suffers from word death. It's no longer erotically charged as it surges through the brain. Translation trains you to get into the habit of words, of crafting words into lines of perception and making the small shifts of syntax and diction that breathe the spirit of language and that save us from word death. As Kenneth Rexroth also says, talking about the ways in which translation can keep us from merely writing in the accepted modes of our own language, you know, which in contemporary American poetry, which it would be to say the contemporary free verse lyrical narrative, the experimental language poet as it's now developed into elliptical verse, or formal poetry in the kind of Robert Frost recycled mode. Those are the three modes of American poetry right now. How can you get out of the trap of merely writing in those three modes? Well, Rexroth would say translation. Translation, he says, saves you from your contemporaries. So, in other words, translation is not merely a way to keep writing and keep in practice. In fact, much modern and postmodern poetry is secretly wired to steal a charge, to steal the tricks from the great literary and spiritual traditions of the world. And really, that's what this talk is about. Consider the example of Robert Lowell in his book of translation titled Imitations. He says baldly in the introduction, quote, "I have been reckless with literal meaning and labored hard to get the tone, to write alive English instead of translating like taxidermists whose poems are likely to be stuffed birds." So he says, quote, "My licenses have been many. My first two Sappho poems are really new poems based on hers. My Villon has been somewhat stripped. This other poem has been cut in half. About a third of The Drunken Boat has been left out. 2 stanzas have been added to Rilke's Roman Sarcophagus, and so on." So clearly this is bad translation. He's using the translation as a kind of an edifice on which to, a kind of a scaffold on which to construct his own building. However, he's quite straightforward about his technique. And thus it seems to me that his work is valuable as poetry in English. When he writes, quote, "All my originals are important poems," we know he's referring to the original poems he's imitating, but it's hard not to read the sentence as also referring to the new originals that he's creating in English, which, remember, what this talk is about. How do you authorize a translation? To say that the imitated object is an important poem is a radical thing indeed, given the scarlet T for translator and that translators who are seen from deviating from the original must wear. It is, in fact, a modern attempt at an ancient practice. It's what John Dryden called the way of imitation, where the translator assumes the liberty not only to vary from the words and the sense, but to forsake them both as he sees occasion, taking only some general hints from the original. It's also the imperial translation practice that the Romans used in appropriating the literature of the Greeks. For the early Romans, quote, translation meant transformation in order to mold the foreign into the linguistic structures of one's own culture. So, okay, let's get into some specifics. Interestingly enough, when you look at some of these examples, and somewhat paradoxically, the farther away from the original the translator travels, the more authority the poem gathers into itself. That is to say, as you become a worse and worse translator, you become a better and better poet. I'll give you an example. In your handout there, you will see some poems by Pierre de Ronsard. Do you see that handout? So you'll see When You Were Very Old, and I'll go ahead and read the Ronsard poem. This is a poem that has been translated many times, but has interesting things that have been done with it. Here's the Ronsard sonnet. When You Are Very Old. When you are very old, at evening by the fire, spinning wool by candlelight and winding it in skeins, you will say in wonderment, as you recite my lines, Ronsard admired me in the days when I was fair. Then, not one of your servants dozing gently there, hearing my name's cadence break through your low repines, but will start into wakefulness out of her dreams and bless your name, immortalized by my desire. I'll be underneath the ground, in a boneless shade, taking my long rest in the scented myrtle glade. And you'll be an old woman nodding towards life's close, regretting my love and regretting your disdain. Heed me, and live for now. This time won't come again. Come, pluck now, today, life's so quickly fading rose. Okay, a beautiful sonnet in the mode of the Carpe Diem poem. In other words, please love me now, let's have sex today before we're old and everything, and all of our beauty and our passion fades. Like Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress and so many other poems of that mode. Here's what Yeats does with it. William Butler Yeats, When You Are Old. When you are old and gray and full of sleep and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with love false or true, but one man loved the pilgrim's soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. And, bending down beside the glowing bars, murmur a little sadly how love fled and paced upon the mountains overhead and hid his face amid a crowd of stars. Is this a translation at all? I mean, he starts the poem pretty close to Ronsard, but quickly veers away after the first line or two and turns the translation into yet another of Yeats's love poems to his recalcitrant lover, Maud Gonne, the woman who rejected him for his entire life. Although they might have slept together once in northern France, it's a little bit debated. No longer a standard Carpe Diem poem, in which the poet tells the woman to love him before he grows old. It becomes a poem in which love itself flees the planet, like the god leaving Antony, and has paced upon the mountain overhead and hid his face amid a crowd of stars. The whole essence of the poem has shifted. Let's look at another one. We'll get to these issues as we go on. Let's go to another one by G.R. Tejada Flores on the handout. It's called Candlelight Blues. The translation problem he set himself was to do a Yeats on Ronsard's sonnet, but this time to translate Ronsard into cowboy poetry. When you're getting old at candlelight, sitting at the fire, gonna spin all night, you say, sort of marveling as you sing my song, good old Ronsard sang when I was young. Then you won't have a maid what hears that sound, just about to fall asleep and all tired down, who ain't gonna wake when she hears my name and start praising your name of immortal fame. I'll be 6 foot under, no skeleton. 'Neath the myrtle groves is where my soul will run. You'll be dreaming at the hearth in a messy old way. Sorry you was proud, now I've gone away. Better saddle up your horse, don't wait all night. Pick your roses today, then you'll be all right. All right, here's the interesting thing. Despite the absolutely radical change in tone, Tejada Flores is a lot closer to Ronsard than Yeats is. In fact, the humor of this parody poem depends upon its being close to the original, but skewing it towards the parodic through what we call a shift in register, right? Register is the kind of language associated with a particular activity, such as advertising speech or cowboy speech, or etc. As the translation mutates and transforms, as it grows feet and crawls for the first time onto the land, it takes on a life different from its old one, breathes a different air, swims in a different element, and wanders at a different sky. It's a new creature on the face of the earth. This is one way in which translation can be authorized, by veering so far away from the original that the translation must be seen instead as a transformation or a transmutation of the original into something new, as a new poem that exists in conversation with the old. I want to give you some other examples of good poetry that is also a bad translation. If you look at another one of your handouts, you'll see the love poems of Marachiko, translated by Kenneth Rexroth. These poems are all translations of the work of an author who never existed. They imitate the concision of a Japanese tanka. A tanka is like a haiku with 2 7-syllable lines afterwards, so it's 5-7-5-7-7. And it's one of the key modes in which Japanese poets write. So it imitates the concision of the Japanese Tanka. Have you guys found it? And it draws particularly from the images of Yosana Akiko and Izumi Shikibu, the great erotic poets of Japan. But they are, in fact, original poems in English. So here, what Rexroth is doing is using translation with what you might call an Emersonian self-reliance. When Ralph Waldo Emerson reads the great wisdom texts of the Middle East and Asia in an attempt to come up with a particularly American form of transcendent individualism, in the same way, Rexroth finds in his Japanese translations a confessional voice, an erotic spirit, and a concise imagistic technique that he wished to replicate in his own original poems. Emerson writes in Self-Reliance that, quote, in every work of genius we recognize, I'll start that again. In every work of genius we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. Rexroth recognized his own genius in the poems he translated from Japanese and from Chinese, because he had done many translations before he did his own imitations. No reason why he should not continue translating directly out of his own imagination instead of from Japanese source texts. Here's a poem by Izumi Shikibu. I am in such bad shape that when a firefly rises out of the marsh grass, I feel my soul leaping out of my body in desire. And here's Rexroth in one of his Marichiko poems. Your tongue thrums and moves into me, and I become hollow and blaze with whirling light like the inside of a vast, expanding pearl. Now, clearly, this is not a direct translation. It's a translation in which there is no original text, just a style, a mode, and a technique, and a set of standard images to imitate and draw upon. Rexroth was writing a Japanese poem in exactly the way the classical Japanese poets wrote, by imitating the masters and by echoing their images. Consider, as long as we're getting a lot of examples on the floor here, Ern Malley, the poet invented by the Australian writers James Macaulay and Harold Stewart in 1944 as a hoax on the poet-editor Max Harris and his modernist literary magazine, which he called Angry Penguins. Macaulay and Stewart invented Ern Malley out of thin air, writing his works in an afternoon, writing down the first thing that came into their heads, lifting words and phrases from the concise Oxford Dictionary, a collected Shakespeare, and a dictionary of quotations. Here's what they say. We opened books at random, choosing a word or phrase haphazardly. We made lists of these and wove them into nonsensical sentences. We misquoted and made false allusions. We deliberately perpetrated bad verse and selected awkward rhymes from a Ripman's rhyming dictionary. Both men were doing this because they lamented the loss of meaning and craftsmanship in modernist poetry, and they particularly despised the well-funded Angry Penguins magazine and were jealous of Max Harris's precocious success. Here's the interesting thing. Harris fell for the joke, publishing the poems with great excitement until the hoax was revealed. This has happened a number of different times, and it's happened in America with the American Poetry Review with, forget the invented name of the Japanese poet. An American poet came up with a Japanese poet for whom he invented a biography. He was a Hiroshima survivor, and his poems have been found and translated by him. And it turns out it was all an invention. And so Boston Review and American Poetry Review published these poems, and then they were very angry, the editors, when it turns out that, in fact, it was all a hoax. And interestingly enough, one of the editors of APR said, in fact, they're terrible poems anyways, which then becomes the question is, why were they published if they're terrible poems? Well, because they were by a Hiroshima survivor. So then you have to think about why poems get published. Okay, all that. Another example of ways in which bad translation can make good literature as we get further and further away from the notion of a source text. We're getting here into the question of personae, masks that we wear, which makes us think about the poems of those poets who use the heteronym, which is to say who write under the name of other poets. Many of the great intertestamental texts that your professor here in religious studies, Martin Meyer, works on are pseudepigrapha, which is to say like with songs associated to, or poems or texts associated to authors who had lived long before in order to give them authority, but in fact they were written by later authors. In the same way, the great Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa wrote under 3 different names or heteronyms: Alberto Caeiro, Alvaro de Campos, and Ricardo Reis, each of whom possesses a distinct biography, temperament, philosophy, appearance, and writing style. Okay, if your brain is not spinning enough, consider this translation technique. It's called the translytic or blind translation, and you'll see some examples on the handouts there. Or another term for it is the homophonic translation, where you do a translation from a language you don't know. You pay attention not to the meaning of the words, but to their sounds, and you come up with something in English that sounds similar. It was that which famously used by Louis Zukofsky, the modernist poet and friend of William Carlos Williams, in his translations of the Roman poet Catullus. Look, for example, at the translytic of Tomasz Solomon's Slovenian poem by the poet John Bradley in the handout. I have no idea how to pronounce Slovenian, but I'll read a couple of lines as best I can. Ti si moj angel, usta pustota secredo, susbanik obradasem nutagad. Okay, good enough. Let's see what Bradley does with this. Yes, you, my angel, you used to, possibly in a cradle, slowly but always sooner, a meadow talking in its sleep. Barely gone, no beetle pulls you. I ravine your oxygen. Just, please, slap me pretty hard. Okay. It's I don't know how good a poem it is. It's interesting, though. It certainly is. And I suppose from a certain experimental point of view, it might actually be considered good poetry. My own thinking about self-reliant imitation, transformation, and transmutation goes back to a certain modernist move in the sculpture of Marcel Duchamp and Pablo Picasso. In a well-known sculpture of a bull's head by Picasso, for example, the piece was constructed from parts of a bicycle. Picasso describes his technique as follows. One day, I took the seat in the handlebars. I put one on top of the other and I made a bull's head. You see, because the seat becomes the snout and the handlebars become the horns, right? Well and good. But what I should have done was to throw away the bull's head. Throw it in the stream anyway, but throw it away. Then a worker would have passed by. He'd have picked it up, and he'd have found that perhaps he could make a bicycle seat and handlebars with that bull's head, and he'd have done it. That would have been magnificent. That's the gift of metamorphosis. This is the same technique, similar to the technique that Marcel Duchamp used in his ready-made sculptures, most notably the urinal that he submitted in 1917 to the New York Society of Independent Artists. These found art sculptures for Duchamp were to be called aided or assisted ready-mades. That they're modified from their original state, rotated, given new titles, attached to other objects. Very much like the kinds of imitations that we see being done by Robert Lowell, where he's translating but also attaching other objects or other bits of poems to the other people's poems and creating these kind of hybrid objects in poetry. A number of you have read my book, Tongue of War, From Pearl Harbor to Nagasaki, a book of poems that I spent 15 years researching, doing my own interviews with veterans and their families, and also working from oral histories, diaries, letters, and so on. And working from those source texts or those pre-texts to create poems. Most of those poems I turned into sonnets, and transformed into sonnets. And in many ways, I would say that what I've done is to create an assisted ready-made which is to say a poem that draws from the language, the spoken language and the stories of others, and highlights it, frames it, puts it on a pedestal, and calls itself art. In many ways, it's kind of found poetry, although it's also transformed in various ways. Many of the poems, for example, take 10 to 15 oral histories and take snippets from different ones and collapse them together and use my own language, but try to be true, like a documentarian, to the general set of events that happened to specific people. So from these beginnings in my own work, I've sought wilder and wilder ways of using translation techniques to create ready-made poems. One way in which I did this was to create, in my pet term, the Frankenstein poem. A poem pieced together with wire and bolts from the dead limbs of the original poem. The idea is to take a chainsaw to the source poem and chop out articles, pronouns, prepositions, and leave only what I call the power words on the metal table, which is to say nouns, verbs, and adjectives. So, for example, I think in your handout you see I have the poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, God's Grandeur. I'll go ahead and read it to you. God's grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dear freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with, bright wings. Beautiful poem. When you apply the Frankenstein technique to it, what you're left with are power words that sounds like something like this. World, charged, grandeur, God, flame, out, flame, shining, shook, foil, gathers greatness, ooze, oil, crushed men, wreck, rod, generations, trod, etc., right? You're getting it down to nouns, verbs, and adjectives. I'm going to go ahead and read you a poem from the Golem of Los Angeles, and that is my own monster poem, based on this technique. It's called God Dead. I feel bad about reading in the chapel. Who knows what the world is? I charged my Nietzsche textbook at the bookstore, hoping that some grandeur after the death of God would flame out, shining from the pages. But I was shaken, crushed like foil. The shop boy sneered at me. Damn him and his nose ring. The cumulonimbus clouds gathered greatness, dark like the ooze of oil. And I ran among crushed men, reckoning how far to my car as the fat drops fell like rods, generating splashes as I trod. And all the neons seared my eyes, trading words with me, vacancy, tattoos, hot croissants. As through the bleared, smeared window of the French bakery, the female baker toiled, wearing a man's smudged shirt, and shared with this man the smells, if not the flesh, if not the soil or soul. No barefoot feel of being in the shoddy world. No croissant for me. Nature is somewhere, spent but there, and still one guesses living, since that's what nature does. Living with the dear freshness of deep things. But I lived then in Los Angeles, and home, looking out the window as the last lights blackened to the west, I went traveling towards morning, writing my soggy bed, until from the brown, smoggy brink of the world eastward came springing what we have instead of the Holy Ghost, bent sunlight over the world, brooding, comforting as breasts, flying on one bright wing. Okay, if you take this technique, see, obviously what you do is you take the power words and you add as many words of your own as you want in between them and just use those words in the same order. And in the process of doing so, your own poem gets charged with the electricity, the genius of the poet whose work you are cutting up. You take someone whose nouns, verbs, and adjectives you really admire, someone like Anne Sexton or Sylvia Plath or Gerard Manley Hopkins, and suddenly your language is rich, right? You have to be kind of acrobatic to make a poem that makes sense. You'll know that your Frankenstein is alive English if the electric charge takes hold and the monster stands up and walks out into the literary village. And if the critics storm your castle, torches in hand, you have only yourself to blame because it's dangerous to steal fire from the gods. Well, so here we are at the end of the talk. I'm guessing that a number of you felt outrage, even despair, when I began to talk about the three paradoxes of literary translation. What author wants to hear that the text doesn't exist? What author would agree with literary theorists Foucault and Barthes that the author is dead? And yet, once you've made yourself comfortable with these propositions, that number one, the translation cannot be original and therefore cannot be literature. Number two, that the translation is a new original and therefore cannot be a copy. And number three, that the original never existed in the first place. The possibilities are galactic. Instead of being wild for approval from authority, meekly presenting your translations as offerings at the temple of the real author, you can now see your work as authorings. Therefore, here at the end of the chat, I think it's time for you to stop being the audience listening to the author. I think it's time for us all to author together. Therefore, after taking questions, I have a few handouts to pass out, so you can try your hand at creating a translatic and a Frankenstein poem. I don't think we'll have time to do it, so you probably have to take it home, but we'll shift it to Q&A at this point, and thank you.